A woman trapped upside down in a car at the bottom of a ravine for 8 straight days, while a 911 operator tells her husband she's simply a grown woman free to go wherever she wants. A soldier who spent nearly 30 years alone in a jungle, still fighting a war that ended before most of his hiding place's neighbors were even born. A baby who vanished from Hawaii and grew up, completely unaware, to eventually solve his own disappearance decades later, purely by pure, unlikely accident. Unlike the videos before this one, tonight's stories aren't about people who deliberately chose to vanish. They're about survival against odds that should have been impossible and returns that nobody was prepared for. Some of these endings will make you genuinely furious. One of them will honestly inspire you more than almost anything else we've covered. And at least one of them will leave you seriously wondering whether coming back is always the miracle it sounds like on the surface. 5 stories, 5 completely different kinds of impossible situations. Let's get into it now, starting with the one story that will genuinely make you want to throw something at your screen. Story 1, Tanya Ryder. Tanya Ryder and her husband Tom were, in every ordinary sense, a young couple doing what a lot of young couples do, juggling multiple jobs at once, saving every spare dollar toward the dream of owning their own home, the kind of quiet, unremarkable grind that never makes headlines until something goes horribly wrong. On September the 20th, 2007, Tanya finished a shift at a supermarket in Maple Valley, Washington, and, completely worn out from back-to-back jobs and barely any sleep, got in her car to head home for a few hours of rest before her second job of the day. She was only minutes from home. That exhaustion caught up with her. Her grip on the wheel loosened, and her car drifted off the road, plunging into a ravine roughly 20 feet deep. When she regained consciousness, she was hanging upside down inside her own car, held in place by her seatbelt and wedged tightly against the steering wheel. Several of her ribs were already broken, and her left leg had gone completely numb. When Tanya didn't come home, Tom called the police, frantic. What happened next is the part of this story that still makes people furious to this day, nearly 2 decades later. The operator who took his call essentially refused to file a missing persons report, explaining that Tanya's situation didn't meet the necessary criteria. She wasn't a minor, and she wasn't considered at risk. The operator reportedly told Tom that his wife was a grown woman, free to go wherever she pleased without having to inform anybody. Somewhere in that same conversation, while Tom was being told to essentially calm down and wait, his wife was hanging upside down in a wrecked car less than a mile from the road, slowly running out of time. Tom knew his wife, and knew this wasn't like her at all. She didn't just vanish without a word, not after a night shift, not with a second job waiting. Refusing to accept that answer, he called the station again and again, repeating the entire story, from scratch, to every new operator who picked up, until one of them finally, mercifully, agreed to file the report. While all of this was happening, Tanya was living through an absolute nightmare. Trapped in total darkness for what would stretch into days, her only source of comfort was the faint glow of her phone screen, still displaying Tom's name every time she desperately tried to reach it, only for the pain and the way she was pinned in place to force her to give up each time. She screamed her husband's name until the phone battery finally died completely. As the days wore on, Tanya drifted in and out of consciousness, growing weaker with every passing hour. At her most delirious, she began hallucinating that she was dialing 911, only to imagine the operator laughing in her face before the line went dead, a nightmare that, tragically, wasn't all that far removed from the real dismissiveness her husband had actually experienced trying to get help for her. Even after Tom finally convinced authorities that his wife was genuinely in danger, the investigation's first move wasn't to search for Tanya. It was, painfully, to investigate Tom himself, a standard but agonizing procedure for any spouse of a missing person. Frustrated but desperate to move things along, he willingly agreed to a full search of their home and a polygraph test, understanding that the faster he was ruled out as a suspect, the faster an actual search for his wife could realistically begin. Once cleared, investigators reviewed supermarket surveillance footage showing Tanya driving away from the parking lot, her last confirmed sighting anywhere. Her bank accounts showed absolutely no activity at all, ruling out the possibility that she'd simply walked away from her own life. Finally, investigators traced her cell phone signal to a tower along Highway 169 in Renton, a suburb of Seattle. Once they finally searched the correct stretch of road, it took a mere 20 minutes to find her. 20 minutes, after 8 days of searching everywhere else. By the time rescuers reached her, Tanya had been trapped in that ravine for 8 full days without food or water, in a vehicle that was likely invisible from the road above unless you knew exactly where to look. Her body was frail, starved, and severely dehydrated. She had, by her own account, essentially given up hope and made peace with dying, drifting toward what she remembered as a warm, radiant meadow in her mind, the kind of peaceful hallucination the body sometimes offers when it's running out of options. "She's alive!" one of the state troopers shouted after spotting her car wedged among the trees below. Rescuers sliced through the vehicle's roof to pull her out and airlifted her straight to the hospital. Her injuries were severe: multiple broken ribs, a shattered collarbone, a dislocated shoulder, kidney damage caused by toxins released from days of crushed, immobile muscle tissue, and a badly mangled leg that came dangerously, agonizingly close to requiring full amputation. When Tanya woke up in the hospital, her husband Tom was right there beside her, the same man who had refused to give up on her from the very first phone call, who'd offered a reward, pushed authorities relentlessly, and voluntarily submitted to a polygraph just to speed up the search. A few years later, Tanya published a memoir titled Missing Without a Trace: 8 Days of Horror, sharing her story publicly in the sincere hope that no other family would ever again be told by a police dispatcher that a missing loved one simply had the right to disappear without anyone bothering to look. Tanya survived 8 days trapped in a ravine because her husband refused to take no for an answer, and because rescuers happened to search the right stretch of highway before it was too late. Our next case is almost the opposite kind of survival story. Not 8 days, but nearly 3 full decades, and not a husband fighting for answers, but a man completely alone, still fighting a war that had ended before he ever knew it was over. Story 2. Teruo Nakamura. Teruo Nakamura was born on October the 18th, 1919, a member of the Amis, an indigenous tribe from the island of Formosa, what we now call Taiwan, which at the time was a colony under Japanese rule. He was 20 years old when the Second World War broke out, and his early life had already been defined by relentless poverty. Driven by a sense of duty, and likely by economic necessity as well, he enlisted in the Takasago Volunteer Unit of the Japanese Imperial Army in November of 1943, and was stationed on Morotai Island in what was then the Dutch East Indies. On September the 15th, 1944, American and Australian forces launched a major assault on the island, a conflict that would come to be known as the Battle of Morotai. Japanese forces fought fiercely but were overwhelmed, suffering devastating losses. While most of the surviving soldiers eventually surrendered, were captured, or succumbed to hunger and illness, a small number retreated deep into the island's dense jungle interior, determined to make a final stand. Nakamura was among them, part of a unit tasked with carrying out guerrilla warfare if the situation called for it. About 2 months after the assault began, having lost all radio contact with his unit, the Japanese army formally declared Nakamura and his remaining comrades dead. He wasn't dead. He was very much alive, just completely cut off from the outside world, and it would take 3 full decades before his family ever learned the truth. For the first 12 years, Nakamura survived alongside a small group of fellow stragglers, living off bananas and fish caught from the surrounding waters, treating every rustle in the jungle as a possible enemy patrol. None of them had any idea the war had actually ended in September of 1945. Leaflets announcing Japan's surrender were even dropped over the island that same year, but Nakamura and his comrades dismissed them as nothing more than enemy propaganda, a trick meant to lure them out of hiding, a belief reinforced by the aircraft they kept spotting overhead, which they assumed were part of an ongoing arms race between the Allied and Axis powers. In reality, those planes belonged to a nearby Indonesian Air Force base, simply conducting routine practice flights, completely unrelated to any war that was, by that point, already ancient history to everyone except the handful of men still hiding in that jungle. In 1956, following what was reportedly an attempt on his life, Nakamura parted ways with his remaining comrades and struck out completely on his own, building a modest hut in an open field. He survived by cultivating sweet potatoes and foraging bananas, fished regularly to supplement his diet, and even built himself a makeshift abacus just to occupy his mind through the isolation. To avoid detection, he only ever cooked under the cover of darkness, hiding any telltale smoke from prying eyes. He tracked the passage of time by observing the phases of the moon, tying a new knot into a length of rope to mark each passing month and year. Living with almost no human contact whatsoever, what kept him going, by his own later account, was nothing more than the hope that he would one day be reunited with the family he'd left behind. Eventually, Nakamura managed to befriend a kind, elderly local man who would occasionally bring him basic provisions and small luxuries like tea and coffee, tiny gestures of humanity in a life that had otherwise become almost entirely solitary. This quiet arrangement continued for several years until the old man eventually passed away, but not before asking his own son, on his deathbed, to continue looking after Nakamura, a final act of kindness passed down like an inheritance. Accounts differ on exactly what happened next. Some say the old man's son was the one who eventually alerted authorities to Nakamura's presence on the island, while others claim it was a pilot who happened to spot his hut from the air. Either way, in November of 1974, the Indonesian government received a tip about a former Japanese soldier possibly still hiding out on Morotai Island, and coordinated with the Japanese embassy to launch a formal search mission. To try to draw him out, searchers waved a Japanese flag and played the country's national anthem near the area. Their efforts paid off. On December the 18th, 1974, Teruo Nakamura, now 55 years old, finally emerged from the jungle, naked, unkempt, and utterly exhausted, yet in remarkably sound physical condition after everything he'd endured, a fact doctors found almost as astonishing as the story itself. He was transported to a hospital in Jakarta, given a clean bill of health, and Indonesian authorities arranged for his return to Taiwan, where his family was waiting, having long since accepted that he was simply another name lost to a war that had claimed millions. What he found waiting for him there was a life almost entirely unrecognizable from the one he'd left behind nearly 3 decades earlier. His parents, once the pillars of his entire world, had both died years earlier, without ever learning their son had survived. His son, who had been a mere infant when Nakamura first enlisted, had grown into a full adult man with 4 children of his own, making Nakamura a grandfather to grandchildren he'd never even known existed. His wife, long since convinced he had died in the war, had remarried and moved on with her life, as anyone reasonably would after 30 years of silence. Then came the matter of his military pension. Despite serving nearly 30 years, technically still on active duty the entire time, the Japanese government refused to pay him his full back pay, arguing that because Taiwan was no longer under Japanese rule, he wasn't technically considered a Japanese citizen. The decision sparked genuine public outrage, especially since another famous Japanese holdout, Hiro Onoda, had been discovered in the Philippines just months earlier and received his full military entitlements without issue. The key difference being that Onoda was an actual Japanese national holding the rank of officer, while Nakamura was only ever a private and ethnically Taiwanese rather than Japanese. In the end, after nearly 30 years of unbroken military service in brutal conditions, Nakamura received a final payout equivalent to roughly $227 American, following intense, sustained public backlash over how unfairly he'd clearly been treated. The Taiwanese government eventually stepped in and made him a separate donation worth roughly the same amount Onoda had received. Back home, Nakamura often seemed weary despite his outward physical health, though he maintained that the hope of reuniting with his family was the one thing that had kept him alive through it all. In a remarkable gesture, his wife's new husband offered to step aside completely and let the old couple reconcile, even offering to move out of the house entirely. Not wanting to upend the life she'd built without him, Nakamura instead chose to buy a home nearby, visiting frequently. He spent his final 4 years living a quiet, peaceful life surrounded by family, before passing away on June the 15th, 1979, after a long illness, leaving behind a legacy remembered as both a courageous soldier and a devoted family man. Nakamura's family waited 30 years without knowing whether he was alive or dead, clinging to a hope that eventually paid off in the most unlikely way imaginable. Our next case flips that same kind of mystery completely on its head. Instead of a family waiting for a man to come home, this is a man who grew up perfectly happy, with absolutely no idea that his entire identity, right down to his own name, was never actually real to begin with. Story 3. Mark's Panama Barns. In July of 1977, a 6-month-old baby boy was reported missing in Honolulu, Hawaii. His birth mother, Charlotte, had been struggling with severe, untreated mental illness and had been wandering aimlessly for some time before being caught trespassing on private property. When questioned by police, she gave a false name for herself, claiming to be someone named Jane, and lied about her infant son's name and date of birth as well, telling officers his father was a native Hawaiian and inventing an entirely different identity for the child on the spot. Charlotte was admitted to a psychiatric ward, and her baby was placed in an orphanage less than 30 miles from where they'd lived. When Charlotte was eventually released, she never came back for her son. She simply vanished, never to be seen or heard from again, leaving behind a case with no leads, no suspects, and, for a long time, no real hope of resolution. The baby, whose real name was Mark's Panama Barns, was adopted and grew up with absolutely no knowledge of any of this whatsoever, living an entirely ordinary, happy, and by all appearances completely unremarkable life under a completely different name, with no reason to ever suspect his childhood had actually begun with a psychiatric ward and an orphanage bed. His case might never have been solved at all, if not for the persistence of one determined relative, his half-sister, Jennifer, who was 8 years older than him and had been living in New Mexico with her own father at the time both her mother and her baby brother vanished within the same year. When Jennifer eventually learned the full details of what had actually happened, she was utterly devastated and quietly determined to find out the truth no matter how long it took. In 2001, she flew to Hawaii and personally pleaded with the police department to reopen her brother's long-dormant case. At her request, police commissioned a forensic sketch artist to create an age-progressed illustration of what her missing brother might look like as a grown man. 10 years later, that exact sketch would end up in the hands of the very man it was created to find. By complete coincidence, the adult man, now going by the name Stephen, came across the illustration and was stunned by how much it resembled his own face, almost as if he were staring directly into a mirror. Friends and family who saw it agreed the resemblance was uncanny, too precise to write off as pure chance. Stephen, understandably, refused to believe it at first, clinging to the comfortable version of his life he'd always known. It was his wife who ultimately pushed him to follow through and get real answers, even though part of him genuinely wondered whether he even had the courage to knock on that particular door, knowing there might be no going back to blissful ignorance once he did. He contacted the Honolulu Police Department, whose officers weren't entirely sure what to expect. After all, Mark's case had been open for roughly 3 decades at that point, and the odds of solving a case that cold, from a random phone call, were slim to none. Still, they took the report seriously. Only a DNA test could settle it for certain, and 8 long months passed while Stephen waited for an answer that would either confirm his growing suspicion or put the whole unsettling coincidence to rest. When the results finally came back, Stephen's entire understanding of his own identity was shattered in an instant. His suspicions were confirmed. His real name was Mark's Panama Barns, and he had just solved one of the longest-running missing persons cases in American history, as the missing person himself, using nothing more than a stranger's sketch and a decade of quiet curiosity. After the media frenzy that inevitably followed a story this remarkable eventually settled down, Stephen was finally ready to reconnect with his biological family. He reached out first to his half-sister Jennifer, who was overwhelmed with emotion and profound relief at finally having answers about her brother's fate after all those years. He then contacted his biological father, Mark, who was absolutely thrilled to finally meet the son he'd lost decades earlier. As for his birth mother, Charlotte, Her fate remains a total mystery to this day. She was never seen or heard from again after the day her infant son was taken from her. Mark spent 34 years living happily under an identity that wasn't even his own, blissfully unaware that somewhere out there, a sister was fighting to keep his case alive. Our next case is far messier, with far fewer clean answers. A woman whose disappearance triggered a genuine years-long manhunt, complete with a chilling hoax letter, a convicted killer with unsettling ties to the case, and a truth that, once it finally surfaced, turned out to be far more complicated and far more human than anyone had expected. Story 4. Michelle Whitaker. Michelle Whitaker was born on August the 16th, 1969, into a large family of 7. By all accounts, she was a happy, energetic child who cherished every moment with her loved ones, the kind of kid who lit up a room without even trying. That began to change around age 15, when her family relocated to Gastonia, North Carolina, and Michelle's teenage years turned turbulent, marked by growing conflict with her mother over what Michelle saw as overly strict rules and a desperate craving for approval that never quite felt satisfied. She briefly considered joining the Navy, but instead fell for a Navy recruiter several years her senior, marrying him against her mother's wishes shortly after high school graduation. The marriage didn't last, ending in unhappiness not long after it began, another disappointment in a life that seemed to be collecting them. Seeking a true fresh start, the family eventually relocated again, this time to Spartanburg, South Carolina. As Michelle approached her 30th birthday, life remained a genuine struggle, working a part-time waitressing job and barely scraping by, month after month, with little sign of things getting easier. Then, one evening after a long shift, she crossed paths with a man named David. Charming and charismatic at first, exactly the kind of easy confidence that makes someone feel safe getting into a car with. David's true nature surfaced after he offered her a ride home, brutally assaulting her and leaving her face badly battered and bruised. A year later, David was finally arrested and charged with assault and battery, eventually receiving an 8-year prison sentence, a small measure of justice that came far too late to undo the damage already done. But the trauma of the attack sent Michelle's life into a downward spiral, drifting between her parents' home and friends' houses, sometimes sleeping in her car, caught in a punishing cycle of anxiety and depression that eventually landed her briefly behind bars following a drunk driving incident, one more low point in a stretch of years that seemed determined to keep knocking her down. After serving her time, Michelle vowed, sincerely, to finally turn her life around and leave the chaos of the previous few years behind her for good. But on August the 5th, 2002, a heated argument with her mother, Laura, ended with Michelle storming out of the house. When Laura calmed down, she realized she had no idea where her daughter had actually gone. Her anxiety only deepened when a man Michelle had been staying with told her he hadn't seen Michelle in days either. Because Michelle was a legal adult with an established pattern of drifting, police initially had limited options. Even a family friend on the force reassured Laura her daughter would likely turn up on her own soon. She didn't. An official missing persons report was finally filed on August the 21st, 2002, roughly 2 full weeks after anyone had last seen her. Investigators dug into every angle, bank records showing no activity, interviews with her ex-husband, family, and co-workers, none of which turned up any solid leads at all. Eventually, they identified a man named Doug Gilmore as the last person known to have seen Michelle, having spent the evening with her at a local pool hall, talking and laughing over drinks, before the two of them took off together on a motorcycle ride into the night. Doug fully cooperated, willingly passed a polygraph test, and explained that he'd dropped Michelle off the next morning at a nearby truck stop, at her own request, since she'd expressed a desire to head toward Myrtle Beach. From there, the trail went completely cold. As the case grew colder, Michelle's mother pleaded with local television stations to keep her daughter's story alive in the headlines, refusing to let the world forget her daughter's name, even as the leads dried up one by one. Then, in August of 2005, nearly 3 years after Michelle vanished, an anonymous and deeply disturbing letter arrived at the police station, claiming to know the exact location of Michelle's body, describing a spot near tall pine trees at the edge of a pond, roughly 25 miles from the truck stop where she was last seen. For a family that had spent 3 years bracing for the worst possible news, that letter felt like the moment everything finally came to a close, one way or another. Police searched the area exhaustively for 2 full days and found absolutely nothing. The letter turned out to be nothing more than a cruel, elaborate hoax, written by someone who apparently got some twisted satisfaction from watching a grieving family's hope rise and then collapse all over again. Utterly devastating for a family already worn down by years of uncertainty. Just months later, in October of 2005, a man named Jonathan Vick was arrested for the brutal murder of Dana Satterfield, the owner of a local beauty salon located roughly 12 miles from where Michelle was last seen. For a moment, it looked like the case might finally be cracking open. Police immediately suspected a possible connection. Jonathan had been a regular at the diner where Michelle once worked, and disturbingly, he was also already a prime suspect in the unresolved disappearance of his own former fiancée, a woman named Heather Sellers, who had also worked as a waitress, just like Michelle. 2 missing waitresses, 1 dead salon owner, and 1 man connected to all 3 cases. It was the kind of pattern that makes investigators sit up straight. Despite the eerie parallels, though, investigators were never able to find any concrete evidence tying Jonathan to either Michelle's or Heather's disappearances, no matter how hard they looked. He was convicted of Dana Satterfield's murder in November of 2006 and sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 60 years, but was never formally charged in connection with either missing woman, leaving Michelle's family with a chilling coincidence instead of the answer they'd been hoping for. 5 long years after Michelle's disappearance, her family gathered for a solemn vigil in her memory, and Laura built a heartfelt memorial webpage filled with photos spanning her daughter's life. Then, in August of 2008, everything changed with a single phone call, arriving completely out of nowhere after 6 years of silence. A woman contacted a police lieutenant, claiming Michelle Whitaker was alive and living in Oregon. She'd recognized Michelle from an episode of the television show Forensic Files, combined with photos she'd seen on the memorial webpage Laura had painstakingly built over the years. To prove her claim, the caller snapped a photo of Michelle and sent it in, and law enforcement passed it along for verification. Oregon State Police paid a visit to the address, where Michelle confirmed her own identity without hesitation, and a fingerprint test later verified beyond doubt that she truly was the long-missing woman everyone had been searching for. When told her family had spent 6 agonizing years searching for her, driving themselves half-mad with worry, Michelle explained that she'd simply grown exhausted with the chaotic life she'd been living, and had convinced herself, after the fight with her mother, that disappearing entirely would somehow lift a burden off her family, rather than add an even heavier one. Her original plan had been to reach Myrtle Beach for informal, under-the-table work, but her journey ended up taking her much further than she ever intended, through Las Vegas, through California, and finally settling down in Oregon, all while she claims she used her own real name the entire time, seemingly, almost unbelievably, unaware of the massive, years-long search happening for her back home the entire time. Michelle expressed deep remorse over the toll her disappearance took on her family and the enormous resources spent by police searching for her. Since being found, she has worked to rebuild and strengthen her relationship with her mother, Laura. Michelle Whitaker's disappearance was, in the end, driven by exhaustion and guilt, a young woman trying to lighten a burden she felt she'd become to the people who loved her. Our final case tonight is a lot less sympathetic and a lot less about survival in the way we usually mean it on this channel. A woman whose miracle return turned out to have very little to do with luck or fate, and a lot more to do with simply running out of new identities to hide behind. Story 5. Michelle McMullen. 27-year-old Michelle McMullen was a resident of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, who had relocated to Louisiana to finish her degree at Grambling State University, chasing the kind of fresh start a college degree is supposed to represent. Balancing full-time school with raising her 6-year-old son, Jalen, entirely on her own proved to be a serious, exhausting financial struggle, and Michelle eventually decided to send Jalen back home to Harrisburg to live with her parents, while she stayed behind in Louisiana to complete her studies, telling herself it was a temporary sacrifice for a better future down the road. On September the 28th, 2008, Michelle arrived back in Pennsylvania, but instead of heading straight to her parents' house, she dropped Jalen off at a friend's place instead. An odd first move that nobody thought much of at the time. Her parents didn't even learn she was in town until the following day. That same day, after saying goodnight to her son and telling her friend she'd call again in a couple of hours, Michelle set off on the drive back to Louisiana. She never made that call. It was the last anyone heard from her for a very long time. Her car was later discovered abandoned in Hagerstown, Maryland, with her wallet, cell phone, and other personal belongings still sitting inside. The classic hallmarks of a case that looked, at first glance, exactly like an abduction or worse. On October the 9th, 2008, local police announced a twist nobody was expecting. Michelle was actually wanted on theft charges. It turned out she'd been working as a secretary for a local Presbyterian church and had stolen nearly $2,400 before being fired that July for poor performance, a detail that suddenly cast her disappearance in a very different light. Then, in December of that same year, detectives received an intriguing tip. A woman matching Michelle's description had been spotted working at a hotel in Martinsburg, West Virginia, where she'd convinced the owner to hire her by claiming she was fleeing an abusive relationship and desperately needed the income, a story that, ironically, wasn't entirely different in tone from the truth she was actually running from. The lead came from an old associate of Michelle's who happened to visit the hotel and instantly recognized her. When confronted, the woman denied knowing him entirely, insisting her name was actually Monique Watson, delivering the lie with enough confidence that a stranger might have believed her. Her old friend wasn't buying it for a second, though. Michelle's parents were immediately notified, hearts racing with the possibility that their daughter was finally, actually alive. But by the time police arrived at the hotel, she had already vanished again, one step ahead as always. The case remained unsolved until February of 2010, when an American true crime documentary series aired Michelle's story during a rerun. One sharp-eyed viewer, watching from her own living room, instantly recognized the woman in the segment as her own hairdresser, someone she'd been sitting across from, trusting with scissors near her scalp, for who knows how long without the faintest idea who she really was. It turned out that Michelle had made her way all the way to California, where she'd met the owner of a beauty salon and lied to her, claiming to be a survivor of Hurricane Katrina who'd lost everything in the storm. Moved by sympathy for a woman who'd supposedly lost her home, her belongings, and her sense of normalcy overnight, the salon owner had taken Michelle in almost like a daughter, even personally teaching her how to style hair, giving her both a trade and, unknowingly, the perfect cover story. After finally being caught, Michelle claimed the roughly $2,400 she'd taken from the church were simply extra paychecks she'd used to fund her education, a justification investigators weren't particularly inclined to believe, and was ultimately charged with theft, forgery, and fraud. In her own words, she later confessed to investigators that the constant, gnawing fear of eventually getting caught had tormented her far more than any prison sentence realistically ever could. Years of looking over her shoulder, inventing new names, and rehearsing new backstories every time someone got a little too curious. In the end, Michelle McMullen was sentenced to probation, along with a fine of $6,000, a strikingly quiet, almost anticlimactic ending for a story that had, at one point, looked disturbingly like it might end the same way as several of the darker cases we've covered on this channel. 5 very different kinds of survival, and 5 very different kinds of return. A woman who nearly died in a ravine because a stranger on a phone line decided her disappearance simply wasn't urgent enough, saved in the end only because her husband refused to accept no as a final answer. A soldier who spent 30 years defending an island in a war that had already ended decades earlier, sustained by nothing but hope, a homemade rope calendar, and the quiet kindness of one old stranger who brought him tea. A man who spent his entire childhood and early adulthood as someone else entirely, with no idea his name, his birthday, and his very first months of life had all been erased by his own mother's illness, and who ended up solving his own 34-year-old missing persons case using nothing but a police sketch and a healthy dose of stubbornness. A woman whose exhaustion, guilt, and desperate need to escape a chaotic life sent her running for 6 long years, only to be recognized, of all things, because of a rerun of a true crime television show, and a woman whose return turned out to have far less to do with being found by loving searchers, and a lot more to do with finally running out of places left to hide from the consequences of her own choices. If there's one thing tonight's stories prove, it's that not every disappearance is the same kind of tragedy. Not every survival story ends the way you expect, and not every miracle ending feels quite like a miracle once you know the whole truth behind it. Some of these people were victims of pure circumstance. Some were victims of a system that failed them at exactly the wrong moment. And at least one of them, in the end, was really only ever running from herself. If these cases had you shouting at your screen, hit that subscribe button, because we've got plenty more where these came from. Real disappearances, real families, and endings that are almost always stranger than anything scripted. Let us know in the comments which case made you the most furious, which one genuinely restored a little bit of your faith in people, and which one you're still thinking about an hour from now. Thanks so much for watching this one all the way through, and we'll see you in the very next one.